This year, I'm going to spend a whole bunch of time and effort really digging into our current building practices, our current building standards, and really asking the question, is what we're doing more environmentally friendly than what we used to do 50 or so years ago? Now, before anybody comes into the comment section and calls me a climate change denier or like a anti-environmental dipshit or something like that, let me be very clear. I want to save the environment. I've got kids. I want them to have a world to live in. I am in no way, shape, or form denying climate change, and that is not the purpose of this podcast. Not now, probably not ever, unless other evidence comes to to light that suggests that climate change is a hoax. I've done quite a bit of research myself, and am fairly convinced that certainly humans have had an impact on the rate at which the climate is changing since the 70s. So I think we can kind of sort of put that one to rest. Now, what the causes are of climate change or whatever else, that is not the purposes of the exercise, at least for this year. For 2026, this year, we're really going to focus in on building practices and building codes. So that is the premise and the preface. And I probably need to start every podcast with that disclaimer so that people don't come yelling at me in the comments because I just don't need it. Today's topic, and this is episode 1 of season 1, if you will. We're going to kind of divide this into 4 different seasons, if you will. And today is, the 20th episode of me doing a podcast, but it is the first installment of, maybe that's what we call it, the first installment of what I am. I think a lot of people are coining the green grift. And so the great building debate, green grift or progress. So we have been mandated here in Canada to adopt and work towards the building step code. And we can talk about that and we will talk about that in future episodes. But for the time being, you're just going to need to trust me that that is a fact here in Canada. And so what essentially this step code has told us is that we need to build airtight, triple glazed, wrapped in plastic homes. And theoretically, building homes in this nature and the current building code is supposed to be more environmentally friendly than the homes of the past. And I am here to really start asking the hard questions about, what is or isn't factually true in that. So, first and foremost, we talk about like this carbon tunnel vision, right? We are like the first thing that we get told is like, well, if we have a gas furnace, we're killing the environment. If we have a home that leaks energy because it isn't airtight or it isn't well insulated, we're killing the environment. And so what we're going to do together is we're going to do a cradle to grave look and kind of, you know, do our best to unpack the facts, right? And I hope anyways, my goal is to start uncovering a lot of the fallacies. And where this is going to get uncomfortable for a lot of people, myself included, is that we have given guidance to our clients and friends and family about what we have been taught and what we've been told is the right way to go about constructing and why it's so important and not and all that sort of thing. And so, it's probably been in the last few years where I've really started to scratch my head at a lot of the things that we're being mandated to do. And so we're going to just continue to talk about this. And it's just an open dialogue and an open conversation. And I'm certainly open to hear what other people's opinions are and what their thoughts are. But I think as we unpack the truth, I think it'll become abundantly clear that there's a lot of elements of the current building code that are actually environmentally unfriendly and not economical. not environmentally economical, and absolutely not economical when it comes to actually constructing a home for somebody. So what we're looking at is the, life cycle assessment or cradle to grave, like we talked about. So what we want to think about and talk about is operational carbon. The carbon that you use to operate your home is is the tip of the iceberg. 90% is in embodied carbon. And what embodied carbon, and that's a big word that, or it's a fancy word that people have come up with. But embodied carbon, like that is when we start to actually capture the actual cost of a good. And by the carbon cost of the good, I should say. So the energy used to mine the ore, forge the steel, melt the glass, and manufacture the chemicals, right? Like that is the total embodied carbon of a product. When we combine all those products, we can start to look and see what the total damage or benefit to the environment is. So let's talk about the clean grid paradox. So if you live in a place like Alberta or West Virginia, your energy comes from coal, and saving energy there, it does make sense. That said, in places like British Columbia or Quebec, our grids are 98% clean hydroelectricity. So, really and truly, any sort of electrical savings, other than just the cost of it, isn't helping the environment in any particular way, because our energy in BC is already clean. Now, obviously, if you're using a gas furnace or boiler or something like that to heat your home, changes a little bit. But let's continue to unpack this. So, the city of Nelson actually did a study, and it found that for some high performance homes in BC, the carbon payback period, i.e., the time it takes for energy savings to offset the emissions created during the construction process, 80 to 90 years. 80 to 90 years. Imagine that. You've got a high performance home, and you have worked tirelessly as a builder. You have paid through the nose as a homeowner to have this home constructed. And you only learn that there is an 80 to 90-year payback for the carbon emissions. Let that sink in, right? Most homes are going to get torn down before 80 to 90 years. Like most homes generally last somewhere in the 60 to 75-year range. Like we do see some outliers where like we've done renovations on 100-year-old homes and whatnot. And that's kind of what pulled me into this is, we do so many renovations as a company, and we go into these homes that were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they're honestly in really good shape for the most part. There might be a minor crack in the foundation here or there, but I mean, that's the exception to the rule, not the norm. No T footings, just, 8-inch foundation right onto solid bearing lumber, just dimensional lumber construction. Cause obviously back then they didn't have engineered wood products. So, relatively simple designs, no air tightness, or, we'll get into the wall assembly and that sort of thing in upcoming episodes and that sort of thing. But I mean, it was a relatively simple home. And when we pull those relatively simple homes apart today, they're in astonishingly great shape for the most part, as long as people have kept dirt away from the siding, right? Like that's really the only time where we start to see issues is when people have allowed organic matter to get above the top of the foundation or slab, depending on the home's construction. So, anyways, I obviously don't want to have dirt touching siding. So these components and the stuff that's going in, like they generally, like at best, are going to last 50 to 60 years. And so if these components are only going to last, and by components, we're talking like Windows, HVAC, that sort of thing. If these things are only going to last 50 to 60 years and the carbon payback is 80 to 90, the math ain't mathin'. We've got a 20-year deficit. And we're not talking dollar value, we're talking, the environmental impact. Let's start challenging the narrative and start challenging the status quo. And what I want you, the viewer or listener, depending on how you're watching this, to really start considering is the long-term effects of the buildings that you're living in or creating, depending on your role in the project, right? It is so easy to fall into like a 5 to 20 year time time frame, time horizon, because it's a little easier for us as humans to comprehend and understand. Like thinking 100 years down the road is a very challenging thing for all of us to do, myself included. Now imagine thinking 1,000. Like, I mean, it's almost impossible to think that far ahead, and really understand like what our actions today might do in 1,000 years. It's tough to really comprehend that. And I mean, let's be honest, it's also pretty hard to predict it because there's just so many variables. And especially when it comes to home construction, there are a ton of variables. So we're definitely going to be digging hard and deep into this year. And I really hope that you're going to subscribe to the channel and hear what I've got to say and really start to open your minds and consider pushing back against the status quo, because the the march towards net zero is a march towards an environmental catastrophe in my humble opinion. All right, so let's start talking right now about the law of diminishing returns and material fragility. We've got an R value scam. Going from no insulation to R20 is a huge win, but going from R20 to R40 requires double the material for, in many cases, only a tiny incremental gain in energy savings. Weird, right? But it's the truth. That second layer of insulation, which is often high carbon foam, right? Spray foam, emits more carbon in the factory than it will ever save in your wall. Say that one more time, okay? The, any sort of foam product is going to emit more carbon in the factory than it will ever save in your wall through energy savings. We are overdosing buildings with chemicals for 1% gains. Forgiveness versus fragility. So we've got in Erik land, we've got Model 1, which is a home built in the 70s, and we've got Model 2, which is a step 5 home built today. So Model 1, it breathes, right? It's not airtight. If it gets wet, it's going to dry. It's a forgiving system built of raw wood and brick. And its carbon debt, if it was built in the 70s, its carbon debt was probably paid off in 85 or something like that from the home construction standpoint. Model 2 is effectively a plastic box. Like the homes we build today rely on perfect taping and perfect taping standards and protocols, membranes. If a single seal fails or the HRV stops working, moisture gets trapped. What we have done is we have traded simplicity and longevity for complexity and fragility. A simple house can last 200 years. A high performance house is one mechanical failure away from a mold crisis. And that is a really, really good way of putting it, right? Like when we look at a home that was built in the 70s, we had very simple construction, right? And it was very environmentally friendly as well, I might add. So the techniques that were used at that time, where you would have the framing crew, typically was the same people that did the form work and the framing. So the framing crew would come and would use shiplap to form the foundation walls of the structure or the concrete. Maybe there's rebar in it, maybe there's not. And once the concrete has been poured, next day or a couple days later, they stripped that shiplap off of the form or off of the foundations, and they reused it for exterior sheathing or for the floor sheathing. I mean, they didn't have plywood back then, right? So nonetheless, like you had this lumber that was getting used for forming the concrete, and then it was getting reused again on the side of the home. Then we had 2x4 construction, simple. We had smaller windows so that we didn't have to have crazy big beams and that sort of thing going on top of that. Now, I mean, we're going to start, I don't know that we're going to get into it this year, but like the seismic requirements for structures in this day and age, especially here in Vancouver, are nuts. And so the amount of additional cost, time, and effort that is put into that, I mean, that might be another topic for another day. But nonetheless, a home built in the 70s was relatively simple: 2x4 wall, shiplap sheathing, one, maybe two layers of building paper, windows, single pane windows, and the wall was able to breathe. The home was able to breathe. Any moisture got trapped or whatever else over the course of the year, heating, cooling, everything got a chance to dry out, right? It never stayed wet all year round. You fast forward to, I mean, even 10, 15 years ago, we started adding poly to the inside of our homes. And that was in an effort to create greater air tightness. I'm just kind of going through the last 20 years of my life. I recall like we still were using building paper on the outside of the home, and we started having to drill holes into the stud cavities underneath windows and sort of areas that didn't have any sort of breathable space. And then we put poly on the inside of it. And what was happening, and I've opened it up and seen it for myself, is condensation would and could form if the insulation wasn't done just right. And that happened because like if you have your poly on the inside of your home, right? And if you have even like a half-inch gap between the poly and your insulation, there's a little air pocket there. Well, if it's really cold outside, you got cold air. And so the backside of that poly is cold, and it's moist a little bit too, especially here in Vancouver, right? So you got cold, moist air on the backside of the poly, and then you've got this warm air inside of the home. And shock and surprise, when condensation started to form on the backside of the poly, and that condensation started to create rot in the structural exterior members of the homes. And so, this simple move was a major issue. And so, what then was decided, because we had this rot happening, is, well, we needed to add, and especially if any like moisture came from, like, got behind the building paper somehow, some way, it was trapped. There was no way for it to get out because there was no air movement from inside to outside and outside to inside in that wall assembly, because you had that plastic on the inside of the wall. Somebody in their infinite wisdom said, okay, well, let's give the wall assembly a chance to breathe. And so we had rain screen introduced. And so now we are having to put pressure treated strapping on the outsides of our home, or, there's other plastics that can be used, like Keen and that sort of thing. And you'll start to hear like there's a lot of like industrial type of stuff, like pressure treated, right? We're talking about injecting chemicals into plywood to preserve it from rotting. Copper sulfate. It and you can't recycle it. It just the only thing you can do with that product is throw it away, and that's got to go to a landfill, right? Same thing with Keen rain screen, right? Once you remove it, it's garbage. It's totally unreusable. So as we're talking this year, and you know, I suspect that this will be kind of my theme for years to come, but especially as we're talking this year in 2026, I always I want your mind thinking about, okay, what does that look like in 100 years when this house is being repurposed, right? When it's being torn down, which home in your mind is going to be more simple to recycle the components of, right? Is that home today with this chemical strapping or plastic and possibly spray foam here and there, and these triple and double pane windows with this additional plastic on the inside of them to keep the sealed units separated? How much of this stuff is starting to sound like this is like easy to recycle, easy to maintain sort of products? And this is where we're, where this point is coming from on like simplicity versus fragility, right? And so a modern home is so dependent on the mechanical systems within it to make it work. Like it's not even funny. Like I notice at my own home, which is a new home. I built it, and I think I built it to step 4, if I remember correctly. I think we got down to 1 air change. I even notice, like I can tell when the HRV is on the fritz here because the air becomes stale. It feels like a little bit more humid in here as well. And of course, like because I know what I'm looking for and I know what I'm thinking about, I go and I'm like, oh shit, the HRV stopped working. So, get it reset. So it's never really like a problem for a long period of time. But you take a home like mine and you switch off the HRV for a few years, I I I can't imagine a world where there aren't issues on the inside of the home because there's nothing dealing with the humidity happening inside of the home. Like you're talking about an airtight box, and you may or may not realize this, but as human beings, we're constantly giving off humidity. It's coming off of our skins, it's surely coming out of our breath. Every time we cook, we're boiling a pot of water, we're having a shower, whatever the case may be, we're introducing humidity to the inside of the home. And unless you are transferring that humidity to the outside of the home, you're going to have problems, right? Like you have to have air movement. And in a home built in the 70s, that air movement happened through the walls. It was magical. Energy inefficient. I appreciate that. What we're really going to be thinking about this year is that energy inefficient home of the 70s really worse over a period of 100 years than a home that we're building today? I don't think so. The question becomes like, why the hell are we doing this stuff? And I suspect there's a couple of different reasons. One of the number of reasons, like I already said earlier, is I think, when you've given somebody advice and you've guided somebody or some people on what to do and you realize that you're wrong, a lot of people have a tough time admitting when they fucked up and they've given that bad advice. And I mean, I don't enjoy it. I'll be the first to admit that. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that it's just we learn. And when you learn new things and when you discover new information, sometimes the guidance and advice that you were given or that you were espousing, realize, well, I was wrong. But a lot of people don't like to admit that. I don't enjoy it either, but you know what? I don't mind too much. So I think that's one of the reasons. The number 2 reason, which is probably the bigger reason, is the money. Got to follow the money, right? There's an economic grift going on here. The question you could ask is, why is the government pushing step 5 if the carbon math fails especially in clean grid regions? And The answer is probably a 1970s house is bad for the economy because it's already finished. You don't need to buy anything for it. Green building mandates are basically a stimulus package for the manufacturing sector because it's going to force homeowners to buy high tech